Good evening, everybody. My name is Jill Zippin, and I am chairwoman of Democratic Jewish Outreach Pennsylvania. DJOP is proud to bring you this wonderful program with politics with Dana and Steve, who are both here. You can wave, Dana and Steve. This is one of several events that we've joined together to host. DJOP, for those of you who are not familiar, is Democratic Jewish Outreach Pennsylvania. We're a political action committee that works to elect Democrats in Pennsylvania and sometimes other states that best reflect Jewish values. Politics with Dana and Steve run political educational events and fundraisers for a variety of candidates. And Steve Sheffey has his newsletter, the Chicagoland Israel newsletter that comes out every Sunday at 6 a.m., which you should definitely sign up for. I want to explain the format of this evening. I will be questioning Martin Raffel on subjects relating to, obviously, the Israel and the Palestinians, and then Dana will be asking Steve questions to which he will respond. And then we would like you to put questions in the chat so you have an opportunity to speak to two experts on this issue. So I'm going to begin by introducing Martin Raffel. First of all, Martin Raffel is a board member of Democratic Jewish Outreach Pennsylvania, and we are thrilled to have him on our board. And he's from Bucks County, Pennsylvania. For 27 years, Martin served as the senior vice president and the director of the task force on Israel, world Jewry, and international human rights at the Jewish Council for Public Affairs. In 2010, he was named project director of the Israel Action Network, a major initiative of the Jewish Federations of North America in partnership with the JCPA to combat the assault on Israel's legitimacy, an initiative he took the lead in conceptualizing. From 1979 to 1983, he was assistant director of the Philadelphia chapter of the American Jewish Committee. He served as executive director of the Pennsylvania Regional Office of the American Jewish Congress and as vice president of the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College from 1986 to 1987. And he's been admitted to both the Israel and Pennsylvania Bar Associations. So without further ado, we're going to begin our conversation on this very interesting and very timely topic. We're going to touch on the issue and discuss Gaza and Hamas and the recent outbreak of violence. So Israel just fought its fourth war against Hamas in the last dozen years, which resulted in deaths and injuries to both Israelis and to Palestinians in Gaza. Israelis had to quickly run to shelters and safe rooms, and there were civilian casualties and infrastructure damage on the Palestinian side in Gaza. What is being done to convey American support for Israel's right of self-defense, including replenishing the Iron Dome rocket defense system with respect to the Israeli side of things?
Jill, before I dive into the question, I just wanted to say that I'm really pleased to be able to share this program with Steve Sheffey. I think it was about a year ago, I participated in a Zoom program he did for DJOP on Israel. And as he was answering question after question, I kept thinking to myself, that's exactly how I would have answered. I reached out to Steve after the program, and I think it's fair to say we've been comrades in ideas and words ever since. And you know, Steve has this newsletter, as you pointed out, and he says one of his items is, if you remember nothing else, and I think the shared core idea that he and I have is a rejection of that zero-sum binary of pro-Israel or pro-Palestinian. I think the two of us embrace a different binary, a win-win binary of pro-Israel and pro-Palestinian. I think we both believe they go hand in hand and are complementary. Now, as to your question, I think that the Biden administration handled the recent crisis perfectly. when the Sheikh Jarrah controversy took place, the proposed evictions and Israel's police actions on Al-Aqsa Mosque, the president and the administration expressed concerns about that. And then when Hamas launched thousands of rockets into Israeli communities, using the events in Jerusalem as a pretext, Israel's response, legitimate response to the rockets, started to receive some harsh criticism from some left of center circles, including within the Democratic Party. But President Biden did not hesitate to unequivocally affirm Israel's right of self-defense. And at the same time, he and the administration, especially Secretary of State Blinken, were working quietly and effectively behind the scenes to bring about the ceasefire. In terms of the Iron Dome, you asked about that, the administration and now a bipartisan consensus in Congress, and when is there ever a bipartisan consensus in Congress? But there is one now in support of full replenishment of the Iron Dome anti-rocket system to Israel. It saved countless Israeli lives. And I would argue that the Iron Dome saved Palestinian lives as well, because had Hamas rockets been successful in causing large-scale Israeli casualties, one can imagine that the IDF would have hit targets in Gaza even harder, causing more Palestinian losses. So I think both the Israelis and the Palestinians should give thanks to the US supported Iron Dome system.
There is a lot of structural damage in Gaza as a result of the most recent hostilities. And many wonder, how can Gaza reconstruction be conducted in such a way without Hamas using these very same materials like steel and cement to strengthen their military capabilities? How can it be used to rebuild their infrastructure and at the same time not be weaponized to harm Israel?
Yeah, Jill, this is a difficult challenge. There's really no panacea here. The past reconstruction efforts that followed the previous conflicts in Gaza, and this is the fourth in a relatively short period of time. All of those efforts did not prevent Hamas from commandeering these dual-use items. Cement and steel could be used to build an apartment building, or they could be used to create fortifications for Hamas fighters and to create that vast underground network of tunnels, which Hamas had made in Gaza. The fact that in the past it's been unsuccessful in preventing Hamas from using these dual-use items for nefarious purposes shouldn't mean that we should not try to engage in reconstruction that will not empower Hamas. Now, to do that, Israel, the Palestinian Authority, Egypt, the United States, international community, we all have to be on board with that as a goal. And as in most international issues, the United States leadership will be required. It doesn't mean we'll succeed this time more than we did the last time, but obviously every effort has to be made.
Fatah is in the West Bank, Hamas is in Gaza. It seems very unlikely to achieve peace with Hamas in power in Gaza. What can be done to remove Hamas or to limit their power?
Yeah, there's only one way to remove Hamas's control over the Gaza Strip in the short term, and that is a massive IDF ground operation that would destroy Hamas's military capability and political leadership. That's not going to happen. The cost in lives of Israeli soldiers would be too great. Israel's not prepared to do that. So there's no quick fix. The only realistic solution, I believe, is to erode Hamas's popularity among Palestinians over time so that the Palestinian Authority can reassert its control in Gaza. Now, unfortunately, in this last round of fighting, Hamas's popularity increased, and that's been, there's data that reinforces that conclusion that Hamas is now more popular than ever. And the reason for that is because Hamas was able to position itself as the defender of Jerusalem and Al-Aqsa, not the Palestinian Authority. So the Palestinian Authority's endemic corruption, and you have to add to that Abu Mazen's recent decision to cancel that long delayed Palestinian election, has also undermined the PA's standing. So how can that dynamic be reversed? Well, first of all, the PA, the Palestinian Authority, has to be encouraged to finally get its act together. It has to deal with the corruption. It has to move in the direction of greater democratization. And second, with the help from the United States and the Arab world, the international community, Israel should take political and tangible steps on the ground in the West Bank to build up the Palestinian Authority in the eyes of the Palestinian public. And I'll have more to say on that shortly.
In addition to the recent hostilities, there's also been a change of government in Israel. Bibi Netanyahu is gone, and we now have a government that represents right, left, and center. And there's even an Arab party, which is part of this coalition. How will this new government differ in its policies than those of Netanyahu's? And what does this mean for peace with respect to the Palestinians?
So I think we need to look at this situation clear-eyed. A government in Israel that ranges on the right with Prime Minister Naftali Bennett, who opposes a Palestinian state and supports annexation of Area C, which is 60% of the West Bank, to Meretz on the left, a party that basically would agree to two states almost today on the 1967 borders, and add to that the Islamist party Ram, which according to its charter sees Zionism as a racist occupying power. A coalition government with that range of parties in it is not likely to achieve a major breakthrough on a conflict-ending agreement with the Palestinians. So I think we would be well advised to enter this new period of Israel's leadership after Netanyahu, after the 12 years of Netanyahu, with realistic expectations. So this new government, we have to keep in mind, rests on the slimmest of margins. To survive, it's only going to be able to work on consensual issues. So what are those issues? Well, first and foremost, this new government's going to have to work on adopting a state budget. The last budget in Israel was adopted in 2018. That's going to be the first test. If this government can't achieve a budget in the near future, we're going to look at a fifth election. Then there is a commitment that the partners in the coalition made to Mansour Abbas of Ram to provide greater resources to Israel's Palestinian Arab population. There's been some rampant violence within the Israeli Arab communities, and they need resources to address that. And Abbas of the Ram party was promised that he would receive those resources. And then, especially of interest to us at DJOP and Steve's operation, there's a commitment to reach out to Democrats to restore, or at least try to restore some semblance of bipartisanship in the US-Israel relationship. And the person who's been assigned the responsibility of trying to move that agenda forward is Yair Lapid, who is serving as the alternate prime minister and foreign minister. And then lastly, also of interest to us, is the question of, can this new government repair its relations with non-Orthodox Jews by taking steps that would reflect greater respect for religious pluralism? And one of the things we're hearing is that there will be an attempt to revive the agreement to set up an egalitarian prayer space at the Western Wall. All of this remains to be seen, but these are areas, at least initially, appear to be consensual. So the bottom line is that this new government's going to have to finesse the Palestinian issue. It's going to walk a fine line balancing the right and the left, and that's not going to be easy. And they're all going to enter this period with an awareness that every single party in this coalition counts. If one of them decides to leave the coalition, we're going to be looking at a fifth election.
That would not be so great. Given that it's a very sort of precarious balance with this coalition, it doesn't seem like, and most experts don't think that we're going to have peace anytime soon, like a large, agreement between the Israelis and the Palestinians. But there are some steps that can be done to incrementally improve conditions on both sides. What steps can be taken to alleviate tensions and to at least have a period of calm, if not a permanent peace?
Right. Well, you're right that we're not going to have any full-blown peace agreement between the Israelis and Palestinians anytime soon. So yes, it's all about incremental progress. I read Naftali Bennett's speech to the Knesset when he assumed the prime ministership. There were two things that jumped out at me. On the one hand, he said, quote, "We will strengthen the building of communities across the land of Israel." Now, what I said before ought to be kept in mind. If Bennett and Yamina think that this is an opportune time to push a strong surge in settlements in the West Bank, that could jeopardize the coalition, because the parties on the left, I think, would not find that acceptable. And Bennett is aware of that. I think his comment about building communities in the land of Israel, I think, was certainly playing to his base. But then it was interesting, later in Bennett's speech, he said, I'm quoting here, "The Palestinians must take responsibility for their actions and understand that violence will be met with a firm response. That said," and here's the important part, "security calm will lead to economic moves, which will lead to reducing friction and the conflict." Then Yair Lapid spoke to our friends at Democratic Majority for Israel last Monday, and he used similar language. He said Israel would continue to find ways to benefit all the people of the region and, quote, "narrow the conflict with the Palestinians." If you want more on this subject about narrowing the conflict, I recommend that you check out Micah Goodman's writings. Micah is a fellow at the Shalom Hartman Institute in Jerusalem, and he uses the term shrinking the conflict with the Palestinians. He's written extensively about that. The point here that they're all making is Israel need not be paralyzed by the status quo. There are things that can be done to alleviate the burdens of occupation, while at the same time keeping our long-term sights set on an eventual two-state outcome. So in terms of helping the Palestinians expand their economy in the West Bank, there are many steps that can be taken with Israel's agreement. There's a paper I recommend to people. It was a December 2020 paper written by the Center for a New American Security. It spelled out in some detail the steps that could be taken to help the Palestinian economy. It talked about getting more access to raw materials, synchronizing Israeli and Palestinian standards, reducing energy costs for Palestinian manufacturers, facilitating movement in the West Bank. One of the big problems the Palestinians face is the restrictions on movement around the West Bank. Getting Arab investors into the West Bank, reducing the number of items Israel restricts or limits Palestinian businesses from using, and then expanding Palestinian access to West Bank water resources. And there are other, if you go to that study, you will learn more about all the ways that we don't have to stand still, that we can move forward on Palestinian economic empowerment.
Over the decades, obviously, the United States has been heavily involved and invested in peace in the region, not just peace between Israel and Palestinians, but the wider Arab world. And now we have a new Biden administration, in addition to the new Israeli government. What is being done by the Biden administration to roll back some of the counterproductive actions of the previous administration vis-a-vis the Palestinian issue?
Well, first, let me mention the decision during the Trump administration to move the U.S. Embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. Now, there were some in our community who were uncomfortable with that decision. I mean, almost all of us believe Jerusalem is the capital of Israel and has always been and will continue to be. The question is recognition, international recognition, whether the U.S. Embassy belongs there. We do believe that the U.S. Embassy in principle belongs there. Some in our community believe that it ought to have waited until there was a peace agreement between Israel and the Palestinians. The Biden administration, wisely in my view, has decided they're not going to return the embassy from Jerusalem back to Tel Aviv. But what they are going to do is they're going to reestablish relations with the Palestinian Authority, which were severed during the Trump administration, including reestablishing a consulate in East Jerusalem that would deal directly with the Palestinians in the West Bank. That East Jerusalem American consulate was always there prior to the Trump years. So having a consulate in East Jerusalem for the Palestinians is nothing new. In addition, and it won't happen immediately, but this administration will look to restore a Palestinian diplomatic mission in Washington, D.C. as well. And finally, consistent with U.S. law, the Taylor Force Act, which was adopted during the Trump years, the Biden administration is going to seek to resume humanitarian aid to the Palestinians that had been cut off during the Trump administration.
Are there new administration, is the new Biden administration looking at new initiatives to facilitate peace? What is Anthony Blinken doing? And is anything that the new Biden administration doing can build on the Abraham Accords? Biden was supportive, during the campaign, he said, of the Abraham Accords. So what's new and what can be built upon?
Well, I think the Biden administration, the Biden and Blinken and the others in senior levels of the administration are coming in with their eyes open. Unlike Obama, when he took office in 2009, he started his administration with a high-profile effort to achieve a conflict-ending agreement. He appointed former Senator George Mitchell as senior special Middle East envoy. Blinken and Biden recognize time is not right for that kind of any kind of agreement on final status. Palestinians are divided. The new Israeli coalition government, as I've explained, is not built for a major peace initiative. So the focus of the administration will be on facilitating conditions that preserve the viability of a future two-state outcome. So on the Israeli side, that means that the administration will urge Jerusalem to refrain from settlement expansion beyond the blocks on the other side of the separation barrier. Don't expect the kind of public confrontations on settlements that came to characterize the Obama-Netanyahu relationship. And as mentioned before, due to the fragility of the Israeli coalition, which includes centrist and left-wing parties, remember Yair Lapid is able to veto any decision Bennett might wish to take. A new settlement push is not likely to happen. But regardless, differences between Biden and the new Israeli government over settlements are going to be dealt with much more discreetly than they were during the Obama-Netanyahu years. On the Palestinian side, the administration will urge them to end incitement and the so-called pay-for-slay policy of rewarding families of Palestinians who've been killed or imprisoned because of terrorist acts. Now, the fact that the differences will be not aired as much in public as they were before, that doesn't mean there won't be strains in U.S.-Israel relations. For example, an Israeli Supreme Court decision on those Palestinian evictions in the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood in Jerusalem is looming on the horizon. This new Israeli government is going to have to figure out a way to navigate that issue, considering its own internal political diversity and its relationship with the administration. The administration has already expressed its opposition to these evictions. Now, in terms of the Abraham Accords, that's really a wonderful development. The administration has pledged to deepen and expand them. They offer, I think, a great opportunity to frame the Palestinian issue in the wider context of rapprochement between Israel and the Arab world. And as Israel and the Arab states come together to tackle regional challenges, security, economy, environment, all hopefully with the help of the United States, the Palestinians can and should be included in those efforts. That's not going to lead to final status negotiations in the short term, but if we build on the Abraham Accords and integrate the Palestinians in them, that can lay the foundation for long-term reconciliation. And finally, let me just say, at the end of last year, Congress, again on a bipartisan basis, approved $250 million in funding over 5 years for Israeli-Palestinian people-to-people programs and Palestinian business development. The program is named the Nita Lowey Middle East Partnership for Peace Fund in honor of the wonderful former Democratic Congresswoman. I believe the administration would be well served to quickly appoint a senior representative to implement that initiative.
My last question for you before we turn it over to Dana and Steve, and this is a topic that Steve addressed in his most recent newsletter. But there are some in Congress and the Jewish community who call for conditioning security aid to Israel, while others say there should, at a minimum, be accountability. And others say that Israel should just get all the aid, full stop. What is your view on this particular issue?
Right. As you said, Steve, in his last Sunday's newsletter, addressed this issue. And as he correctly pointed out, American assistance to Israel has always come with strings attached and conditions. For example, the $38 billion package that was negotiated during the Obama-Biden administration with Israel in an MOU, it came with conditions. One example, there are a number, but one example is that over time, Israel is going to have to phase out what's called offshore procurement, which means more and more of the money that Israel receives in this package will have to be used to buy US-based articles and services. In the early years, Israel is able to use a lot of this money to spend on its own defense material. The real question, and as Steve pointed out in his newsletter, is not whether there ought to be conditions, but what conditions are appropriate. So the members of Congress and some of our Jewish organizations have started to advocate additional conditions, and they want to use the leverage to prevent Israel from deepening its occupation of the West Bank. Now, I believe that that in some ways I share the frustration that people have with the situation in the West Bank. I'm fear that we're gradually losing opportunities for a two-state outcome, and I know the frustration about settlements. But threatening to withhold U.S. security assistance to Israel, I believe, is not the way to go. Even if some of the funds eventually would be withheld because of settlement activity or some other Israeli activity in the West Bank, that's not going to change Israeli policy. And plus, this is a political non-starter. There's no way that kind of conditionality would ever get through Congress. And moreover, if we start to go down that path, that's only going to exacerbate tensions within the Democratic Party, which DJOP, I think, would be interested in trying to avoid. To his credit, President Biden has come out clearly, unequivocally against conditioning Israel's security assistance beyond the conditions that already are placed on it. So I have a better idea. And if Secretary of State Blinken is listening, if he's participating, maybe he'll take it under advisement. So instead of threatening to withhold US assistance, maybe Saudi Arabia, so far they're not in the circle of the Abraham Accords, maybe Saudi Arabia could be enticed to come into a more open relationship with Israel, something that Jerusalem really covets. I mean, that's the jewel in the crown, potentially, of the Abraham Accords would be an Israeli-Saudi relationship. Perhaps the Saudis would come in exchange for some Israeli restraint on settlement activity. So, for example, freezing settlements beyond the blocks or making other kinds of progress on the Palestinian issue. That kind of thing, if you begin to work with the Abraham Accords to try to move Israel in a direction, not because you're threatening their security assistance, but because you're dangling something that they really want to achieve, maybe that's the better way to go. So I turn the baton back to you, Jill, and to our colleagues.
So I am very pleased to turn it over to one of my best friends, Dana Gordon, who we all love, and to Steve. And they are going to take over the Q&A. And again, before they begin, if you have a question that you want Steve or Martin to answer, just put it in the chat because we will go to your questions when Dana and Steve are done their discussion. Take it away, Dana.
Thank you, Jill and Martin. It is refreshing to hear about Israel in more than little Facebook or tweets, that we can have a very robust conversation of common sense ideas and plans for Israel and United States relationship. I'm going to introduce Steve Sheffey. He's the president of Steve and Richard Sheffey Consulting, which specializes in public policy, communications, government relations, and legal services for businesses and nonprofits. He is the Steve in Politics with Dana and Steve, the leading pro-Israel progressive democratic organization in the Chicago area. As you all know, Steve writes a weekly newsletter which has included appearances in publications such as the Huffington Post, the Jerusalem Post, the Times of Israel, the Hill, and the Daily Beast. His clients include the Jewish Democratic Council of America, where he serves as senior strategy and policy advisor, and his pro-Israel advocacy experience includes CityPAC, a pro-Israel PAC based in Chicago, where he served 2 years as its president. So Steve, we're going to talk about some of the Democratic progressives, which we include ourselves as pro-Israel Democratic progressives. People focus on the left-leaning Democrats in Congress, but isn't it true that Democrats in Congress remain and vote overwhelmingly pro-Israel?
Thanks very much, Dana, for that question. And also, I want to take this opportunity to thank Jill and Democratic Jewish Outreach of Pennsylvania for organizing this event. I want to thank you, Dana. You do so much in the Chicago area and nationally, both with the events you and I put together and all the other things you're involved in, and also, of course, Politics with Dana and Steve. And Martin, it's a tremendous pleasure to be on the same panel with you. We do agree on a lot of things, and I learned a lot from listening to you. I wish, it's kind of a tough act to follow. I wish I'd go on first, but I'll try to get to some of the questions and then we'll see what it all turns out. As far as progressives are concerned and Democrats, I agree with you, Dana. Democrats overwhelmingly support Israel. And I think what we need to understand, as Martin said at the very top of the program, is that there's no contradiction between supporting Palestinians, between being concerned about the plight of the Palestinians, and with support for Israel's safety and security. So when you see polls, for example, that say more Democrats than Republicans sympathize with the Palestinians, or more Democrats than Republicans support aid to the Palestinians, that doesn't mean they're not pro-Israel. It means they recognize that to be pro-Israel means living into our Jewish values, and it means recognizing that if we want peace in the region, which I think we do, that means a two-state solution, and that means two states with both peoples living in peace and dignity. If you're concerned about Democratic support for Israel, the votes prove that Democrats overwhelmingly support Israel. Look at every single vote. It's very strong Democratic support for Israel. And are there a few outliers? Yes, there are. And if votes were weighted based on Twitter followings or media hits, I might be concerned. But they're not. It's still one person, one vote in the United States House of Representatives. And if you look at what the only poll that for sure matters, the only vote that matters, the votes of the United States House of Representatives and the Senate, you see that Democrats overwhelmingly, and we're talking new Democrats, old Democrats, Democrats elected in the last cycle, 2 cycles ago, it's overwhelming support for Israel, and there's no reason to expect that's going to change.
Great. We also discussed the new Israeli government with Martin. How does the diversity of the new Israeli government offer opportunities to address some of the issues posed previously by the progressives in our community?
Well, I don't think it really does, because I don't think the issue is not, no, the people who are concerned about Israel are not jumping up and down because there's not enough diversity in Israel's government. That was never the issue. They're concerned about what's going on in the West Bank. So the fact that there's more, it's like a non sequitur. You're suggesting they're not concerned about that. They're really, most people understand that in pre-1967 Israel, there is tremendous diversity. There's pretty much close to full equal rights for everyone in pre-67 Israel. The issue is what's going on in the West Bank. And the concern of some progressives is what's going on in the West Bank and the unequal treatment that's occurring in the West Bank. Now, again, there's no contradiction between criticizing Israel's practices and supporting Israel. I mean, we frequently criticized Donald Trump. Didn't mean we were anti-American. Millions of Israelis criticized Benjamin Netanyahu. That's why he's not in office anymore. It's okay to criticize Israel as long as you stand up for Israel's safety and security. In fact, it enhances your credibility if you can point out that we're not talking about the Israel that Leon Uris wrote about in his novels in the 1950s, an Israel that never existed. And we don't need to pretend that Israel is perfect, because it's not. But we do need to recognize that despite its flaws, we love Israel, and there's nothing wrong with loving Israel. And it makes a lot of sense to support Israel's safety and security, even as we criticize Israel. And some progressives will, but we should not mistake that for lack of support for Israel.
Do you think that there's a role groups like ours and DJOP and JDCA can do to further the messages of the Democratic Party and their strong support of Israel?
But I think that it absolutely is. I mean, all of us need to speak up. Some of us are reluctant to speak up, understandably so, because it's not always comfortable. And many, there are very few members of our community who are Republicans but the problem is they're very loud, they're very vocal, they're bullies sometimes, and we cannot be afraid to stand up for ourselves. In a nice respect, we should not emulate their tactics of bullying and saying things that aren't true, but we should never hesitate to stand up. And some people, understandably, don't want to get that kind of abuse. And groups like Democratic Jewish Outreach of Pennsylvania, JDCA, Politics with Dana and Steve, part of our role is to stand up. And even if we can't persuade people, although I think we will persuade people who are open-minded, we can certainly let people know that they're not alone. That when they hear the nonsense from the Republicans, they're right to recognize it as nonsense, and we can help articulate what they're feeling and give them the support they need. So I think there's a huge role for organizations like ours, and I'm very proud that we've been playing that role very well.
Okay, I'm going to pivot. Iran. So we were big advocates for the JCPOA, which Trump then negated as soon as he came into office. Preventing a nuclear armed Iran is vital, not only to Israel's security, but also to ours. Preventing Iran from spreading its terrorism is also a big ideal and vitally important. Biden has said that he will bring the United States back into the nuclear deal that was negotiated with Obama, the 2016 JCPOA, based on compliance for compliance. Iran just elected a new leader who is very hardline. What do you think is coming now?
Well, what's coming now is going to be, as I think we all know, as I hope we all recognize, in 2015, whether the Iran deal was a good deal or a bad deal was a hypothetical question. No one really knew. Now, the opponents of the Iran deal, even in 2015, could not present a better, more realistic alternative because there was none, and there still isn't. The Iran deal was working until Trump withdrew from the deal. Israeli and American intelligence and military experts agreed it was working. And even some of those who initially opposed the deal also opposed Trump's withdrawal from the deal. In fact, 4 of the 6 living ex-Mossad directors have praised the deal, which reduced Iran's uranium stockpile by 98% and established 24/7 monitoring of its key nuclear facilities. It's all gone thanks to Trump. Now, what we've got is, we know, so now it's not hypothetical. We know the deal worked. We know without the deal, we're worse off. The Iran deal achieved its goal of taking the threat of a nuclear-armed Iran off the table, and Trump walked away. Then Trump's maximum pressure strategy failed. His efforts at the UN to continue the arms embargo against Iran failed. And his efforts at the UN to snap back sanctions against Iran failed, all because Trump withdrew from the deal. Under Trump's maximum pressure strategy, Iran accelerated its nuclear program and enacted measures that would have been prohibited under the Iran deal. And now Iran is closer to nuclear weapons than it was when Trump took office. His maximum pressure campaign yielded minimum results and made the US and Israel less safe. Biden's approach makes the most sense. And his approach, as you mentioned, is compliance for compliance. We're not going to make concessions until Iran does, but we're going to get back into the deal, the exact same deal we had in 2015. It would be a nightmare to try to negotiate more. And there just isn't time because Iran is so close. Once we're back in the deal, once the threat of a nuclear Iran is off the table, then we work on lengthening and strengthening the deal and countering Iran's other nefarious activities, such as terrorism and proxy wars. I mean, if you think that these issues are difficult now, imagine how difficult they would be if there was a nuclear-armed Iran. Now, some people will say, oh, the deal isn't good enough. If we just get back to the deal, what about terrorism? What about proxy wars? Why don't we get chocolate ice cream every Friday for dessert? You know, I'd love that, but you just can't do it. It's just not realistic. And Biden's approach clearly makes the most sense. As for the recent elections in Iran, remember the Ayatollah is the person who controls it. The new president will have a say in what goes on, but he's not really the decider. It's the Ayatollah. And a lot of the thinking is that it could really work out to everyone's advantage if we can get back into the deal before he takes office. That's the hope. If anything, this might accelerate progress toward a deal, and then he wouldn't be in the position of having to decide. If it works, then it's a better economy for Iran and he's in a great shape. If it doesn't work, it's not his fault, it's his predecessor's fault. So it's way too early to tell. And the Biden administration has been clear, it's not going to be rushed into a deal. If it's not a good deal, the administration won't take it. But I am hoping, and I think we're all hoping, that the election in Iran will make it easier to get back into the deal.
Thank you. Moving on to anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. You write about this often, how they're not necessarily the same thing. Apart from attacks on Jews here and elsewhere in the world linked to the Gaza conflict, which should be condemned unequivocally, there has been a robust debate about where to draw the line between criticism of Israel, even strident and not fact-based criticism, and anti-Zionism, and whether anti-Zionism or delegitimizing Israel, such as described as an apartheid state, is the same as anti-Semitism. So you and I have this conversation daily, and we go around in circles because I say something and then you say something and then I think something else so tell everyone what you think. Because again, it is a very complicated issue, and depending on which issue we bring up, we have a different answer.
It is a very complicated issue, and the answer is going to be, I'm going to make a spoiler alert right now. The answer is going to be, it depends. And part of the reason it's such a difficult issue is that it's so emotional to us and it cuts so deeply to who we are. Just to be clear, I am a Zionist. No, 100% I'm a Zionist. And when people deny the right of the Jewish state to exist, it does make me mad. It does upset me. It really does get to me. And I think it gets to all of us. But we, at the same time, we have to recognize that harsh, unfair criticism of Israel, or even denial of Israel's right to exist, is not necessarily anti-Semitism. It can be anti-Semitism depending on how it's expressed. But to give you some examples, and sometimes it's easier to explain the concept with examples. Suppose you're a Palestinian. Suppose you're Rashida Tlaib, and suppose that your family, not abstract, literally, your family was driven out of Israel, or at least that's the way you see it, because of Zionism. Now you're not going to be, it's not anti-Semitic. It could have been anyone. Could have been the Crusaders, could have been any foreign power. You're going to be pretty mad at a movement that, from your perspective, prevented you from having your home, your literal home, and prevented your people from having their own state. At least that's how you see it. Now, you could be wrong about that. We could have a debate about that, but I don't think it's necessarily anti-Semitic to have that belief. After all, Jews didn't have a state for 2,000 years. It's become a big part of our identity, and it is essential. I want to be really clear about that for us to have a state, but it's not necessarily anti-Semitic. One could ask, is one anti-Palestinian or bigoted against Palestinians if you don't support a Palestinian state? Many in our community don't. If you live in Mea Shearim, or you live in Brooklyn, frankly, and you are an ultra-Orthodox Jew who doesn't support a state of Israel, a Jewish state of Israel, because you think it jumped the gun on the Messiah, are you anti-Semitic? Are you anti-Kurdish if you oppose a Kurdish state? And this really gets to the heart of it. I think most people would agree the Kurds are an oppressed separate ethnic group that could really benefit from a state. It's pretty clear that as a group without a state, they've been punished and discriminated against pretty severely. But why not have a Kurdish state? Because there are trade-offs. And many people believe that the trade-offs are just too great, taking a slice of Turkey, Syria, and Iraq to create a new state. And some people feel the same about Zionism. Again, we can disagree strongly. And the other thing I want to mention that we also have to keep in mind is that because Israel is a Jewish state, we really have to distinguish between the state of Israel and the people of us, the biblical Israel, the dream, and the actual modern state, which is subject to international law. And the state of Israel uses Jewish symbols. And that also creates a blur between criticism of Israel and anti-Semitism. If you're going to draw, for example, a political cartoon, what are you going to use to symbolize the country? You're going to use probably the flag of the country. That's the easiest thing of all. And if you're drawing a political cartoon, that means you're a satirist. That means that you are almost by definition being unfair. And that means that if you want to criticize Israel in a cartoon, you're going to use a Jewish star to symbolize Israel. And that comes really close to anti-Semitism because that is Israel's flag. So I think we have to look at how people are expressing their opposition to Zionism. We have to look at if they're simply using Israel as a substitute for Jews and using anti-Semitic tropes, then it's anti-Semitic. But it's not necessarily anti-Semitic. And we can't necessarily jump to that conclusion. It requires nuance and it requires listening. And my view is if we're not sure if it's anti-Semitism, better to debate it on the merits, because we do have a very strong case.
And on the other hand, when the Israel-Gaza conflict was occurring, there were bands of people going around New York, Illinois, Los Angeles, different college campuses, screaming at Jews who were having dinner, going for walks, attending classes. So we do know that many people do use the conflict to promote their own anti-Semitism.
And although even there, though, you're right. And even there, though, you don't even have to get to the question of is anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism. In the instances you just described, those are clearly anti-Semitic. Doesn't matter. You're attacking people because they're Jews. That's the definition of anti-Semitism. The why is irrelevant. All the attacks you described were anti-Semitic, no question about it. And those we have to call out, no question about it.
Also pretty important to speak with your Congress people and let them know that anti-Semitism is hate and go on the record and call them and be proactive, correct?
Right. And we have to call out the anti-Semitism in the Republican Party too. We shouldn't be shy about that. I mean, you've got Donald Trump, the leader of the Republican Party, who trafficked in anti-Semitism throughout his entire life, including his presidency, including even last week. You've got the leaders of the Republican Party. Kevin McCarthy sent out a tweet basically saying Jews were trying to buy the election, never apologized. Steve Scalise, number 2 Republican, called himself David Duke without the baggage. That's not really a good thing to be, but the Republicans nevertheless voted for number 2. Liz Cheney was one of only 23 Republicans who voted against the anti-Semitism resolution in 2019. She was voted number 3 Republican. She's no longer in leadership, not because of that vote, but because she called out Trump on his lies about the election, and she was replaced with Stefanik, who's a member of the Sedition Caucus. So with Republicans, it goes straight to the top, and we can't be shy from pointing out that's not both sides. Anti-Semitism is only infected one party from the bottom to the top, and we can't pretend that both sides are the same when they're not.
Thank you. This was a great conversation. Jill, I'm going to hand it back to you.
Sure. We have several questions, and I'll take the tail end of what you said with respect to one of the questions in the chat with respect to the idea of Zionism. You know, Jews were thrown out of every country, and the only place where we have found sanctuary is Israel. So the question is, if this is the sanctuary for the Jews, how is anti-Zionism not anti-Semitism? And both of Martin and Steve, these questions are for both of you, so you can both chime in.
I'll go. You go ahead, Martin.
Yeah, I mean, I would say on many things, Steve and I are 100% in agreement. On some things, we're not quite in full agreement. I'm a little bit harder line on anti-Zionism in the sense that And by the way, I agree, Steve, that to a certain extent, I give a pass to the Palestinians because they were really deprived of their homeland as a result of Israel's creation. I'm hoping it won't happen today or tomorrow, but over time, even the Palestinians will come to accept that Jews were also indigenous to that part of the world, and that we need to both recognize each other's legitimacy between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. Because if that can't be achieved, even if with the Palestinians, we have to recognize their legitimacy, and I believe ultimately they're going to have to recognize Jewish national legitimacy as well for there ever to be a durable, long-lasting peace between that sliver of land between the Jordan and the Mediterranean. Look, I sort of, it's such a complicated issue. In some respects, I feel like we get so absorbed in these definitions. What's anti-Zionism? What's anti-Israel? What's anti-Semitism? Where do we draw the lines? I think we spend so much time in trying to tease this out that we're sort of, missing all the other things that we need to be doing to advance the agenda of support for Israeli security and support for Israeli-Palestinian reconciliation, where we in the Jewish community are really into defining things and definitions and who's in and who's out too much. I think we're into that too much. Now, having said that, and again, giving the Palestinians a pass, those who were not directly affected, who make it their mission to dismantle Israel as the nation state of the Jewish people. They're striving to undermine Israel in that fashion. I sort of, in my mind, there's kind of there's almost a presumption that there's some anti-Jewish animus that's lurking there. Maybe that presumption can be rebutted, but if non-Palestinians are out there fighting tooth and nail to dismantle Israel as a Jewish state, a Jewish democratic state, my presumption is that there is some anti-Jewish animus that's behind that.
And I would just add to what Martin said, because I agreed with all of it, is that there, in many cases, there is. And I want to be really clear. This is why I love to write rather than speak, so if I can actually have it there. But there's no question, in many cases, anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. There's no question about that. There's zero question. And I'm reading Deanne Gross's, I hope I pronounced her name right, comment. And what she says is right about what we've been through and why we need a state. And that's the debate we have. The only thing I would add is, when you look at the Palestinians, if you deny the right of the Jewish people to a state, that's anti-Semitism. That is anti-Semitic, because every people has a right to a state, and we do too. You're hating Jews because they're Jews, and it's anti-Semitic. But if you're a Palestinian and you're saying, I don't really think it was a good idea because I'm not prepared to make the trade-off, I vehemently disagree, but it's not necessarily anti-Semitic. And if someone sympathizes with we welcome our allies. If someone sympathizes with the Palestinians, they may or may not be anti-Semitic. One could wonder why they're so obsessed about the issue. But we welcome people who are obsessed about our issue too. So I think that while in many cases it's anti-Semitic, all I'm saying, and it's hard because it is so emotional, all I'm saying is that we should not jump to the conclusion that it is inherently or necessarily anti-Semitic. It can be, it often is, but we should not automatically declare it anti-Zionism, anti-Semitic, because you're basically declaring a lot of people who aren't anti-Semites, anti-Semitic.
And to use the label anti-Semitism is, harsh. And so you have to be very careful. When you start throwing around the term anti-Semitism, you're really closing down any discussion, because someone who's anti-Semitic, if they're engaged in anti-Semitism, you're saying they're beyond the pale and therefore not worthy of engagement.
Right, exactly. You
have to be really very careful when you use that term.
Yeah, I agree.
And another term that's fraught, and I think, Steve, you have written about this, and Martin, you and I have spoken about this a little bit, is the two words, apartheid state. So you've heard Israel referred to as an apartheid state in Europe and, in the United States as well. Some say, well, it's only the occupied territories, but not Israel, the state. It's a very fraught word. What is your opinion, both of you, on the use of that word, and how does that word in any way relate to anything in Israel?
Well, it's a very loaded term, obviously. I prefer not to use it because it means so many different things to so many different people. Now, we have to remember, former prime ministers Yitzhak Rabin, Ehud Barak, and Ehud Olmert have all warned that unless the occupation ends, Israel is headed toward becoming an apartheid state, and they actually used that word. Recently, two former Israeli ambassadors to South Africa. Now think about that, Israeli ambassadors to South Africa. If they don't know what apartheid is, I don't know who does, or if they're not qualified to talk about who does, said that what's happening in the West Bank is apartheid. Israel clearly is not an apartheid state because in pre-67 Israel, there's, as we talked about at the top of the program, there's diversity in the government, there's equal rights. There's no question there. The question is what's going on in the West Bank. Is that like apartheid? And if the West Bank becomes part of Israel, or if as a practical matter becomes part of Israel, it becomes harder to argue that Israel is not an apartheid state. Now, the other question, of course, is nothing is like South Africa. The strongest argument against Israel being, or even the West Bank, is it's clearly not, is nothing like what happened in South Africa, although there are certain similarities. But nothing is like the Holocaust either. If we can't learn from previous, what happened in previous countries at other times, you can't learn lessons from anything because everything is unique. So I prefer not to use the word, but I think we have to recognize that to many observers, it does appear. Human Rights Watch came out with not their own definition of apartheid, but they used an international definition of apartheid that almost no one even knew existed until they came out with their report. And again, it's a dangerous playing with words. It's a very loaded term. I think it's better to describe what is, but we're going to keep getting those accusations as long as what's going on in the West Bank continues, because the bottom line is that Jews in the West Bank have different legal rights from Palestinians in the West Bank. And you can call it what you like, but that's perhaps defensible under a temporary military occupation. In fact, it is defensible, but the longer the occupation appears to be permanent, the more difficult it's going to be to defend against these charges, which is why those three former Israeli prime ministers deliberately used that word.
Well, it's been clear for a long time that if Israel wants to try to maintain permanent control over the Palestinian population in the West Bank, it would have to choose to either be a Jewish state or a democratic state. It can't be both. You can't maintain, you can't have a Jewish state if half the population or more than half the population made up of Palestinian Arabs. So it would be a terrible choice if Israel, so that's why instead of, spending too much time worrying about the labels, that we ought to be encouraging the Biden administration, frankly, and the new Israeli government to start taking those incremental steps that I talked about in my presentation before toward a two-state solution. Ultimately, the only way Israel will be able to remain Jewish and democratic is if there is a separation into two states between the Jordan and the Mediterranean. And so, time's a wasting. And we really need to have our administration using the Abraham Accords, which I think opens up new possibilities for us. And Israel ought to be encouraged to not to move the clock back on looking for two states, but move the clock forward.
There has been all kinds of ideas of how to achieve peace in the Middle East, and consensus seems to be around a two-state solution. But there have been articles, and I think, Martin, you and I spoke about this a little bit at one point several months ago, because I believe there was an article in the New York Times about it, a confederated approach to two states. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, I mean, the person who is behind the confederation idea probably the most is an excellent American-born Israeli pollster and analyst, Dalia Schendelin. So if you really want to deep dive into the confederation idea, look up Dalia Schendelin. She's the one who's really been pushing that issue. Look, from my point of view, I think confederation might make a lot of sense eventually, but to get to confederation, you first got to get agreement on basically two state entities. You'd still have to have an Israel and a Palestine that would agree to join in confederation to begin to share some powers. That's what confederation means. You share some, and it makes sense. I mean, it's a small area, so that they would share certain responsibilities for security, for environment, for economy. It makes a lot of sense to have a confederation between the two states. But first, you got to get to the two states. That's really the challenge.
And also, I think, if those are interested, the Israel Policy Forum did a really great analysis of the various proposals: two-state solution, confederation, one-state solution, nothing. I think with confederation, again, it depends on what you mean, because even under a quote-unquote two-state solution, there would still have to be a lot of cooperation between those two states. They'd have to have a way to share water. They'd have to have a way to address common security concerns. So I think it's more a matter of, my understanding is confederation is more of a matter of degree and how closely they'll do that sharing in terms of travel and things like that. But it's intriguing, but none of us are going to solve it right here. The bottom line is you have to have everyone, all the parties to the conflict and the President of the United States need to be willing and politically capable of moving forward. And that requires, at the same time, you have to have three leaders, like, for example, Sadat, Begin, and Carter. That was a unique situation where we had three leaders who were all strong enough and courageous enough and politically willing to make it happen. And unless you have all three at the same time, which we don't right now, we might not even have any, it's not going to happen. And that's going to be too bad, because time is not on Israel's side. The longer the occupation looks more and more permanent, the more difficult we're going to face the dilemma that Martin described earlier of Israel having to choose between being a democracy or a Jewish state.
So the United States has been a broker of peace, and the American Jewish community has been very supportive of Israel. But there's beginning to be, and we see this from polling, a generational divide in the support of American Jews for Israel, with American Jews that are younger being less connected to the state of Israel and thus to some degree less supportive. Can you speak about that particular issue and what it means for both Israel and for the relationship of US Jews to Israel?
Yeah, speaking for myself, I'd be curious to hear Steve's response to that question. I'm happy if the younger generation supports Israel. First of all, I want the younger generation to have a relationship with Israel, to have some engagement with Israel. My concern isn't so much that they're hostile to Israel. My concern is that they don't care. It's actually totally irrelevant to them. And I'm not sure sending hundreds of thousands of young people on these 10-day birthright trips was the panacea. I don't think that's the silver bullet. So I think our challenge in the Jewish community, if we want the younger generation to believe that a relationship with Israel is an important part of their Jewish identity, who they are as Jews, then we have a big challenge, because they're growing up at a time when Israel is not. I grew up at a time when Israel was popular. They're growing up at a time when Israel is unpopular, and so this is it's not the same era, and we have to really be very creative, very patient, very committed to bringing a younger generation into relationship with Israel. And if they turn out to be, they decide they want to be advocates for Israel, fine. If they decide they don't want to necessarily go out and be advocates for Israel, that's their right. They need to find their own journey in terms of their relationship with Israel. But let's get them on the ladder before we turn them into little, advocates.
Dave, what are your thoughts on this?
I agree with what Martin said, and this is the danger of a panel like this. We have two people who could probably give each other speeches. I would just add, I'm not going to repeat what he said because I agree with it, but at the same time, you have this issue of some younger Jews being not engaged, which is understandable to a certain extent, because unlike us, they didn't grow up with an Israel that was existentially threatened from externally. The threats to Israel are more internal, and that's harder to see. On top of that, you've got young Jews who one might expect to be very committed to Israel, those who went to day school, Jewish summer day camps and such, Jewish overnight camps, realize that what they were taught is not true. They get a very idealized, sanitized version of Israel again. They're taught that the Israel that is actually exists as the Israel out of the pages of some novel. And when they realize that that's not true, they sometimes move to the completely other direction. They feel confused about that. So I think we need to find a way to educate the kids who are interested in Israel to understand and to learn how to love Israel like they love the United States, which is far from perfect.
And we owe them honesty.
Mhm.
We owe them being able to experience and see Israel as it is, Steve, as you're
Right.
indicating. We're not a sanitized version, but the real Israel. And there's enough of the real Israel, I think, that can promote a positive relationship.
Mhm.
In order to get to two states, we need to support the Palestinians. What are your thoughts on aid to Palestinians, and what things should Blinken and Biden put pressure on Israel to do to make life easier for Palestinians and maybe extend a hand towards two states?
Well, one of the things Martin mentioned, and I would echo, is he recommended Mika Goodman's book, Catch 67. I do strongly recommend everyone reads it. And some people noted, in fact, it was the person who translated that book into English noticed this, because I didn't, that Naftali Bennett used language very similar to Goodman's concept of shrinking the conflict. Given that there won't be a two-state solution tomorrow or the next day, what Israel can do is make life better for the Palestinians. Maybe, take a hard look. How many checkpoints are necessary? How many restrictions are necessary? Maybe, for example, not evict people from East Jerusalem. There are things that Israel can do to make life better. And we, at the United States, absolutely. I mean, a strong Palestinian Authority is essential for Israel's security. Humanitarian aid to the Palestinians is just the right thing to do. A people without hope is a very dangerous people. And we shouldn't give them false hope, but I think it helps Israel's security, and it's the right thing to do to absolutely maintain and support Israel's safety and security, and at the same time provide humanitarian assistance to the Palestinians, which is not contradictory to that. In fact, I think complements it.
Yeah, and they did not pay me to plug them. Steve mentioned the Israel Policy Forum before. The Israel Policy Forum, if you go to their website, they have an extensive amount of material there about things that could be done to enhance the standard of living in the West Bank, the security for Palestinians. The IPF, the Israel Policy Forum, works with Commanders for Israel Security, which is a group of over 200 senior security officials in Israel who have mapped out a whole program of how Israeli security will not be compromised, but can only be enhanced by helping the Palestinians with their own security and their own economic empowerment.
There are a couple people asked a question about the nation state law and whether the new government will address it. Can you explain what that is and what the new government will do with it?
Well, the nation state law was adopted I guess, a number of years ago now, which declares, that Jewish people have the exclusive right to national identity within the state of Israel. It did some other things that were annoying to the Israeli Arab citizens, including, for example, it downplayed Arabic language, it demoted Arabic language compared to the status that it had before adoption of the nation state law. Even the Druze community, which, as you know, serves in Israel's army and they've been very loyal citizens of Israel from the outset, were very hurt by the adoption of the nation state law. The language is some of the language is sort of acceptable. It's, Israel is a Jewish state. So in that sense, I don't think it broke any new ground, but the way it was framed, some of the language, some of the specifics were hurtful to the Israeli Arab community. And I don't, again, given the fragility of this coalition government in Israel that's now, embarked on this exciting journey that it's about to take, I don't see that it's going to be tampering with the nation state law. I think that's just going to be too too hot to handle. And by the way, Mansour Abbas from the Ram Party, his interest was not in those kinds of legal or symbolic things. He wants money. He wants resources for his people. He wants to deliver the goods, not so much on a symbolic level, but he wants a share of the pie. And a lot of the Israeli Arab citizens are very happy that he's moving in that direction.
And we have time for one more question. And what the question is, do you believe there really is a pathway to peace? The question is, are you more optimistic or pessimistic given the recent violence and war and the positive of a new government? Do you think things are going in the right direction, the wrong direction, or we're still going to be stuck in the status quo?
Well, I guess I'll take that softball question first, and I'll have the last word. And I want to, by the way, again, thank you and Dana and Martin for such a wonderful event. I learned a lot from listening to Martin and from hearing your questions and Dana's questions. I hope everyone else enjoyed it. As far as this question is concerned, I have no idea if the new government is what it's going to do. It's a very fragile coalition, as we've discussed. Bennett, we know, is a big proponent of settlements. If he had his way, he would probably want even the next parts or all of the West Bank, but he'll be constrained by his government. He'll be constrained by the Biden administration. He'll be constrained by reality. So hopefully he won't. You have to be out there. You can't live life if you're not. And you can think of all sorts of horrible things going on, plenty of causes for pessimism, but things tend to work out in the long run. We've been around for thousands of years. You really can't judge right now. Nothing's going to happen tomorrow or the next day, but you just never know. Who predicted the fall of the Berlin Wall? And then all of a sudden it happened. Who predicted the collapse of the Soviet Union? Then again, all of a sudden it happened. There's so many. Who predicted the rebirth of Israel? I mean, Herzl did, but many people thought that was a pipe dream. I mean, so many things have happened. The key is for all of us, and this goes back to Dana's question, the key is for us, for DJOP, for politics with for JDCA, for everyone, you can never give up hope, because then you will lose. That's the only sure thing. You've got to keep trying. You've got to keep working. You can't give up. You've got to believe, and it's going to work out. What's the Rabbi Tarfon said? The work is not ours to finish, but neither are we free to desist. We just have to keep doing all we can to make the world better in every way we can, and we are, and then trust and have faith that's going to work out. And I think it will. I really do.
Anything you want to add to that, Martin?
All I would say is amen, brother.
Well, I want to thank all of you for being on this call today, this Zoom today. Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Martin. Thank you, Dana. Please sign up for Steve's newsletter. Every time I read it, I get a little bit smarter. It's fabulous. Please make sure you go to other events with Dana and Steve. They always have fabulous speakers and you learn a lot. Please go to djop.org and sign up for our newsletter. Please as well support us financially if you would like. We always have events and are doing events, and as a political action committee, we support Democratic candidates running in the state of Pennsylvania, and we do it with your support. But again, thank you to our speakers. Thank you to you. And if you have any further questions, you can send them to Democratic Jewish Outreach PA, and we will pass them on to the speakers and try to get answers to you. Thank you so much and have a good evening, everybody.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Shalom.
Oh, wait, what do you
Shalom.
do? Bottom right.